Brazil's air defense debate has quietly entered a decisive phase. For years, the country has acknowledged a structural gap in its ground-based air defense architecture, particularly beyond very low-altitude coverage. What has changed recently is not the diagnosis, but the willingness to address it through a strategic procurement pivot. The decision to step away from negotiations for the Indian Akash surface-to-air missile system and instead open talks around the European EMADS concept marks more than a change of supplier. It reflects a broader reassessment of how Brazil wants to build air defense capability through the 2030s, balancing sovereignty, interoperability, and industrial ambition. Brazil's current air defense posture remains heavily weighted towards short-range solutions. Portable and vehicle-mounted systems provide point defense, but coverage at medium and higher altitudes has long been described in official and specialist commentary as insufficient. Reports circulating in international defense media have repeatedly noted that effective coverage has been limited to roughly 3,000 meters in altitude, a figure that may be acceptable for countering slow or low-flying threats, but inadequate in an era of standoff weapons, advanced aircraft, and unmanned systems operating at greater height and range. In a country with continental dimensions, vast maritime interests, and critical infrastructure dispersed across immense distances, that limitation has strategic implications. This challenge is inseparable from Brazil's unique operational geography. The protection of the so-called Blue Amazon, Brazil's immense maritime zone rich in natural resources, demands more than naval hulls and patrol aircraft. It requires an integrated air and maritime picture, linking sensors, command and control, and interceptors into a coherent defensive web. On land, the protection of air bases, energy infrastructure, and key urban centers presents a similar problem of scale. Air defense, in this context, is not a standalone capability, but a connective tissue across the broader defense system. In recent years, Brazil has taken visible steps to strengthen the sensor layer of this architecture. The development and deployment of the Sabre M200 Vigilante radar represents a significant milestone. With a reported detection range of up to 200 kilometers, the system enhances situational awareness and provides a foundation for more effective command and control. Just as importantly, Sabre M200 reflects Brazil's emphasis on national technological autonomy. The radar program, developed with strong domestic participation, signals an intent to control critical elements of the detection and tracking chain rather than rely entirely on foreign black boxes. However, sensors alone do not close an air defense gap. They merely expose it more clearly. This reality explains why Brazil explored the Akash system as a potential medium-range solution. On paper, Akash offered a relatively affordable entry point into layered air defense, with export credentials and an established production line. Yet negotiations ultimately stalled. According to multiple reports, a central issue was the unwillingness of the supplier to offer the most recent version of the system, raising concerns about long-term relevance, upgrade pathways, and integration flexibility. For Brazil, which has repeatedly emphasized life cycle costs and future growth over simple acquisition price, this was a decisive red flag. The Akash episode highlights a recurring lesson in Brazilian defense procurement. The core question is rarely whether a system works, but whether it can evolve. Brazil's modern defense programs, from combat aircraft to naval platforms, have consistently prioritized access to upgrades, technology transfer, and integration rights. A system that arrives already approaching obsolescence or locked into a rigid configuration conflicts with that philosophy. In air defense, where threats evolve rapidly and software plays an increasingly central role, this concern is amplified. The subsequent pivot toward the European EMADS concept must be understood in this light. EMADS is not simply a missile, but an integrated system architecture encompassing sensors, command elements, and interceptors designed to operate as a flexible, networked whole. For Brazil, this aligns closely with the desire to build a layered and scalable air defense architecture rather than a single, isolated capability. European systems also bring a track record of interoperability with a wide range of sensors and command networks, an important consideration given Brazil's growing investment in indigenous radar and command technologies. Equally important is the industrial dimension. Brazil has long sought to leverage major defense acquisitions to strengthen its domestic industry. The success of programs associated with Embraer has shaped expectations across the armed forces. Major investments should translate into national know-how, skilled employment, and export potential. European suppliers facing competitive global markets are often more open to industrial cooperation frameworks than many of their counterparts. For Brazil, EMADS is therefore not only a military option, but a potential platform for deeper technological and industrial integration. Financial credibility is another factor underpinning this strategic shift. Brazil's defense ambitions have often been constrained by fiscal volatility, leading to delays and capability gaps. Recent legislative developments, however, suggest a more stable outlook for modernization funding. Proposals discussed in Congress point to a dedicated defense modernization envelope totaling 30 billion Brazilian reais, structured to provide approximately 5 billion Brazilian reais per year over a 6-year period, starting in the second half of the decade. While implementation details remain subject to political negotiation, the intent is clear: to insulate critical modernization programs from short-term budgetary turbulence. Complementing this approach is the proposed end-of-fort mechanism, a financial structure intended to support long-term defense projects through alternative funding channels. By reducing reliance on annual budget cycles, end-of-fort could provide the predictability required for complex acquisitions such as integrated air defense. For systems like EMADS, which demand phased implementation, training, and integration over many years, such financial stability is as important as the technical specifications themselves. Looking toward the 2030 to 2035 timeframe, Brazil's air defense trajectory can be framed through several plausible scenarios. In a conservative path, Brazil could pursue a relatively rapid acquisition of a European system with limited industrial participation, prioritizing near-term capability. This would close the most pressing gaps but risk repeating past patterns of dependency. A more balanced approach would emphasize phased procurement, beginning with command and control and sensor integration, followed by interceptor acquisition, tied to measurable industrial offsets. The most ambitious scenario would embed EMADS within a broader national architecture, integrating systems like Sabre M200 and fostering domestic competencies in software, integration, and sustainment. Each scenario carries trade-offs, but all point in the same strategic direction. Brazil is no longer content to treat air defense as an auxiliary capability. It is increasingly viewed as a strategic enabler, essential to protecting sovereignty, supporting joint operations, and reinforcing Brazil's role as a security provider in South America and the South Atlantic. The decision to move beyond Akash and explore EMADS reflects this maturation. Ultimately, Brazil's reassessment of its air defense strategy is a test of institutional coherence. Success will depend not only on selecting the right system, but on aligning procurement practices, industrial policy, and operational doctrine around a shared long-term vision. The coming years will reveal whether Brazil can translate its strategic intent into a genuinely layered and resilient air defense architecture. If it does, the shift from Akash to EMADS will be remembered not as a procurement detour, but as a turning point in Brazil's defense modernization journey.